Good morning, everyone. I think we are waiting on a couple of members of our panel, but we'll see how we go. Whether we've got one coming and another who's potentially in a press conference who will get here soon. But my name is Rachel Withers. I am the editor-in-chief of The Politics, and I'm
hard going, mate, isn't it?
I am delighted to be moderating this conversation on the power of political leadership and evidence-based policy.
Great talk.
Perhaps the most infuriating thing about this climate conundrum that we find ourselves in is the fact that, as a few speakers have noted, we do know what works. There's plenty of evidence and plenty of experts who are not shy about telling us what works. And we have all the money and technology we need. The deficit seems to lie in policy and political appetite. And this panel will hopefully be able to explore why that is. Each of our panellists will deliver some brief prepared remarks. We might just do those sitting down, and then we will dive into a conversation. I've got some questions lined up, but we might have time for a couple of audience questions at the end, depending how we're going for time. I'll introduce our panellists for you now. First up on the end here, we have the former Governor of the Reserve Bank, Bernie Fraser. Mr. Fraser has decades of experience in public economic policy in Australia, including serving as the RBA Governor from 1989 to 1996. He's worked in the Commonwealth Public Service for 25 years, including 5 years as Secretary to the Treasury and 3 years as the Director of the National Energy Office, and he has extensive involvement in the non-profit industry superannuation movement and was also the inaugural chair of the Climate Change Authority, serving for 3 years before resigning in 2015. After that, we have Dr. Fergus Green, a lecturer in political theory and public policy at University College in London. Dr. Green works on the politics, governance and ethics of decarbonisation, including the just transition, fossil fuel supply and Green New Deal style policy programs. He's published in a range of academic journals and has contributed to the UN Environment Programme's fossil fuel production gap report. He previously worked as a lawyer in Melbourne, specialising in climate change law, before moving to London in 2012 after receiving a Sir John Monash Scholarship to support his PhD at the London School of Economics and Political Science. After that, we have Dr. Sophie Scamps, the independent member for the federal electorate of Mackellar. Dr. Scamps made history at the 2022 election by becoming the first independent to win the Northern Beaches seat, after promising a new way of doing politics, putting the community first and campaigning on a platform of climate action, integrity and equality. Before deciding to stand in the election, Dr. Scamps was a practicing GP and a doctor in the emergency department of Mona Vale Hospital. She's also the founder of Our Blue Dot, a community-led NGO that aims to help individuals and community groups reduce their impact on the environment. And last but not least, we have Dr. Monique Ryan, the independent member for Kooyong. Dr. Ryan was formerly Director of the Neurology Department at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne and a Professor of Medicine at both Melbourne and Monash. In May 2022, Dr. Ryan was also elected as an independent in that election for the seat of Kooyong, having stood on a platform of action on climate change, integrity in government, gender equality and healthcare. Her areas of climate focus in the coming year are electric vehicle affordability and availability, household electrification, native forest logging, and the Middle Arm development in the Northern Territory. So without further ado, I might just ask each of our panellists to go through their prepared remarks. You can stay seated and we'll just have a chat at the end.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, yeah.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Richard, and the Institute for taking the initiative and organising another very important summit, this time on our climate and biodiversity crises, which to me I think are the most pressing challenges the world faces today. So thank you for the initiative. We have been warned, of course, for a long time about the threats of global warming. Scientists and others have been doing that for the last 30, 40 years, and those warnings have been reinforced particularly emphatically in the last 5, 10, 15 years by real-life experiences of some of the consequences of global warming. Heat waves, bushfires, floods, floods, rising sea levels, all those kinds of things. So they've underlined the scientists' warnings and have provided some real-life experiences for everyone to see that the scientists have got this one right. But despite all those warnings, the world's response to those warnings has really been underwhelming, I think it's fair to say, at least to this point in time. And the world's goal of getting to and keeping the global warming to 1% or less in degrees centigrade increase looks like a lost cause already, I'm afraid to say, the way the numbers are going and the way that climate change and global warming seems to be accelerating. And at the same time, I think a lot of those countries, including Australia, that have made commitments to get to zero net emissions by 2050, those sort of commitments too are looking pretty shaky, it seems to me, and that's leads to why we have to be talking about the other things that have to be done and the things that will work. And I'm afraid that, it's sad to say it really, but I think Australian governments have been quite prominent underperformers in both the global and international theatres in terms of contributing to getting on top of global warming. And the coalition governments, of course, as we will all remember, were a failure in both domestic and global theatres. And in fact, their attitudes, their behaviour on climate change, their lack of any significant policy measures, all those kinds of things really amounted to what I think was a cruel betrayal of present and future generations of lots of Australians, which won't be readily forgotten. Then the current government, Labor government before and now, they've tried, I think they've understood what it's all about, and they haven't tried to deny the existence of the problem and so on. And they've made some steps in the right direction, but as I heard one of the earlier speakers say, which expressed a view I agree with, they've tried to do a few things and they've done a few things, but they clearly haven't done enough. And one must always wonder about their credentials to do enough when, as again we heard earlier on today, when they have this attachment to, at the same time, setting targets to get to zero emissions in 2050. At the same time, they're running around opening up and developing new coal, or encouraging the development of new coal mines and gas fields and so on. And it's hard to have confidence in the seriousness and genuineness and capability and courage of a government to get to its commitment on emissions while it's at the same time pursuing those kinds of things. And I only just want to mention a couple of actions, policy actions that I think would work and would help, but not so much because of the two measures I'm going to mention. They're old hat really in a way, but clearly top of the list of urgent action for the Australian government should be to dispense with the phase out promptly fossil fuel activities altogether and redirect all those billions of dollars into more productive things that will help to bring emissions under control more quickly and more efficiently and more visibly. So, in terms of what would work and what is urgent and what I think should be a target for pressurising our present government, getting rid of that supply chain of fossil fuel activities should be top of the list, and no doubt is top of the list of many people. The second measure I mentioned is again an old chestnut in a way, but it works, and that's really what we're supposed to be pursuing and wanting to talk about here today, and how to get them implemented. And that, of course, is a tax price on carbon. These things work, but they also have the big advantage of generating a lot of revenue that can be hypothecated, directed, dedicated to doing all sorts of helpful things in the climate change area, and helping transmission, production and transmission of electricity from renewables and electric motor vehicles, household electrification. There's a whole heap of things that could be done and should be done, but require money. But that would come from getting rid of the fossil fuel subsidies, but also by having the courage to take a step on a tax on carbon. Unfortunately, we got to the situation in Australia where both the oppositions and the governments have scared one another too much to dare to go down that path, so nothing is likely to happen unless the pressure comes from outside to achieve something. And there's been pressure, and there will be pressure, and it's possible that there might also be a bit of pressure that will come over the next couple of years from outside, and that is if the countries, and I think the Europeans are probably among the leaders here, some developed countries who are thinking about imposing a border tax on energy-intensive products that are coming into their countries. Those countries that already have a domestic tax on their carbon, they don't really want to allow the same sort of products they're producing that are energy intensive in their own countries and paying the tax to come in from outside, from countries that are not paying any tax. And they're getting around to or talking about what would be a pretty complicated, but if they get it in place, an understandable measure of putting a border tax on the import of emissions intensive goods from countries that don't have a domestic carbon price. And that will be an incentive and a pressure for countries to consider seriously about, getting such a tax to be able to get into these markets without the border tax.
Thank you, Mr. Fraser. We'll come back to that idea, especially about pricing.
Could I have just one more moment, please? Oh, I can't now. I'm a slow talker.
I think you're answering my very first question for the panel. Go finish your stuff.
I just wanted to say that, why can't we have all these things that we know will work implemented? And that's really what I was getting around and wanting to focus on. And that's because our democracies have slipped several pegs over the last couple of years. You only have to look at Australia, US, UK, and others. And how have they slipped and what have been the consequences? So let me just be very quick, and because it's really the point I wanted to make, and I was a bit slow in getting here, but I'm drawing on the help of a very well put together book that was published last year by Martin Wolf, the leading economics commentator on the Financial Times. He's put out a book that explains why all the causes that have contributed to democracies in Australia and the US and other countries slipping, and he highlights a point that I wanted to just read to you. It's only one sentence, and he puts a lot of weight on the most important symptom of the decline in the relevance and help of democracies in some developed countries these days, is what he calls a loss of trust in the notion of truth. And he goes on to say, again very briefly, that once this happens, once this loss of faith in truth happens, the possibility of informed and rational debate among citizens, the very foundations of democracy, has evaporated. Now that's really what I wanted to say, and we might be able to come back to some implications for that later on.
Dr. Ryan.
Oh, thank you. I'll be quick. I mean, no. Sorry, that wasn't implied criticism, please. Look, I'm here because in my previous life, I was a medical scientist and I did medical research, and I've got a bit of a sneaking love of something which in medicine we used to call evidence, which is sadly lacking in much of the stuff that goes on in this House. I mean, we've seen most recently the Leader of the Opposition make a trip to Perth during the Dunkley by-election and come back with a newfound love of nuclear, which most of us are still struggling to get our heads around. I think I can speak for Soph and myself and other members of the crossbench when, we are people who have come into this place with an understanding of evidence-based decision-making in whatever area that we were working in previously. We want to see it from our political leaders. It's very clear to us that, unfortunately, the major parties in this country are very much subject to the influence of vested interests who are influencing the decision-making that they've made. If you talk about climate and the health impact of that, which I feel very strongly about, unfortunately, the fossil fuel lobbies are still influencing decision-making and the policies of the major parties in this country. And so my place in this House will be to try to hold them to account and to look at the evidence for the damage that they are doing when they allow new coal and gas projects developments in this country, and that's what we will continue to do at every chance. I've been talking a lot about distributed energy networks and the potential for them to support the clean energy transition, but I also think that we have a distributed energy network in this place when you look at the people in the House and in the Senate and how we're working together to try and hold this government to account and how we will continue to hold the opposition to account as best we can. That's why we're here and that's what we're doing.
Dr. Fergus Green.
Thank you. Yeah, so the question that the Australia Institute posed to the panel was, what works? And when we hear the question, what works, we should always want to ask, to what end? In other words, what's the goal or the objective that we want to achieve? And if that's a good goal, then we can ask, what works? What's the best way to achieve that goal? So we're here to talk about climate change, and I think we would all pretty much agree that the goal should be to protect Australians, First Nations people, our Pacific neighbours, and really people all over the world from climate change, from the worst aspects of climate change, right? And so if we care about minimising the harms of climate change as a goal, then what really matters is global emissions, right? We need to bring down global emissions. Now, before you start thinking, this sounds like the start of an argument that someone like Tony Abbott might make, opponents of climate action are always saying, oh, it's about global emissions, so it really matters what the big countries do. Therefore, we should sit back and let other countries decide how much Australia will burn and flood. Well, no, I would draw a very different conclusion, starting from the same factual premise, which is that global emissions matter. And the conclusion I would urge us to draw is that, in fact, we and the Australian government should be doing everything in its power to bring down global emissions. And Australia is a powerful country. We actually have a lot of power, particularly in our region. And we have to think about our domestic decarbonisation strategy. I'm not saying that's not important, that's really important, but we need to think about it also in the context of a foreign policy strategy to decarbonise, in particular, our region where we have most power. And that means investing in, strengthening and using our instruments of foreign policy, diplomacy, investment, trade and aid. And really I think that strategy should be about transitioning from being a fossil fuel export superpower to a clean energy export superpower. And I just want to quickly highlight what I think are sort of 4 key overarching themes of that strategy. I won't go into any detail. We can come back and talk about it more in the Q&A perhaps. But so number one, and I think we should really focus on this laser-like first, is to stop expanding fossil fuels. And that means for us, stop expanding coal and gas production. So no new coal and gas exploration, production, and expansions of existing projects. And in our region, that means working with other suppliers and globally to also stop new production, and working with the importers of fossil fuels, to stop new coal-fired power stations, gas-fired power stations, and other fossil fuel consumption infrastructure, right? So we need to sort of work to achieve that no new fossil fuels. Secondly, then that will obviously need to be a prelude to a managed phase down of existing fossil fuel production and consumption infrastructure. Thirdly is about scaling up our clean energy production, our role in clean energy supply chains, and leveraging government support for and addressing rules on trade, dealing with aid where necessary, and investment to support countries, particularly in our region, to replace fossil fuels with clean energy. And then fourth and finally, an area that I've done quite a bit of work on, is we need a just transition. And in Australia, that means supporting workers and communities in the fossil fuel sector to transition to a sustainable economy. And that means things like having a clear timetable for phasing out fossil fuel production capacity. It means supporting workers to transition into sustainable jobs, and it means investing to support the economic diversification of those communities. And the final thing I'll say is I've recently done some work with 2 co-authors, some research on Spain. They shut down their 28 coal mines in around 2019, 2020. And they did that as part of a just transition agreement negotiated with workers, with unions and with companies and regional representatives. And so they shut down their coal mines, they invested in the coal regions, and they supported workers. And this was actually politically popular. And what we show in our paper was that the governments that did this, their vote share in the coal mining regions actually increased, and we can attribute that to the Just Transition Agreement. So it's even possible not only to have a managed transition and a fair transition, but if you do it really well, it can even be a politically popular transition.
And now Dr. Sophie Scamps.
Hello, thanks everyone for coming. Wanted to say that good climate policy is a function of a healthy democracy, and what happened at the last election, where there was a whole lot of new independents that came in, that didn't happen for no reason. It happened because there was deep frustration, particularly around what had been happening on climate action or the lack of climate action. For so many years, we had been waiting for action on climate change, because if you are a person who believes in the science, and we shouldn't even say believes in the science, but who bases decisions on science, then it makes absolute sense that we should be acting as fast as possible on climate change. But we haven't, because climate change in this country has been a deeply politicised debate. And so that's why you saw people being disenfranchised from how they normally voted, and voted for somebody or something that was genuinely going to represent them. And a lot of that was around climate action. So we know we have the solutions to climate change. We know the technology exists, but what doesn't exist is the political will. So what we're doing as independents on the crossbench is pushing for greater action, to be listening to the science. I think we were deeply disturbed even just last week when the opposition leader discredited the CSIRO for his own political purposes. And that's what we're talking about. We need to take the politics out of this debate. And one way that we need to do this, and a lot of us on the crossbench are working in different ways to increase the integrity of our democracy, because as I said, a healthy democracy, you get far better decisions when you have a strong, healthy democracy with independent institutions that underpin it. So I'm working on ending jobs for mates. We need to take that political influence out of these institutions. Monique Ryan is working on lobbying reform, and we're trying to get donation reform because we know that there's such strong vested interests that are influencing policy. This is too important for us to be swayed by industry and other influences. So it is so important when we're talking about climate action that we are working and talking as well about building the infrastructure of our democracy, and it is so important because that's how good decisions are made. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for those comments. And I actually wanted to pick up right where Sophie left off there, in terms of what it is that is stopping us from having integrity in our climate policy in Australia. I'll let you kick off there, Sophie.
Well, Monique, I'll let you go too on this, but we have a number, as I was mentioning, for me, a really key policy strategy for me is that ending jobs for mates. So we need to take that political influence out of these bodies that underpin our democracy. We saw, and this is just going off climate change, but it's an example, we saw what had happened with the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, where it was absolutely stacked with political friendlies and cronies. So there was that great deal of political influence in one of the key democratic institutions that underpins our democracy. That is not democracy, so that is something that needs to be addressed. So giving an example where this is relevant for climate action, let's think about the Environment Protection Agency. Currently the way that the legislation is looking like it's going to be drafted is that the CEO of that body will be appointed by the minister at the discretion of the minister. That is not an independent body. That is not this body will have the power to oversee and make sure that our national environment laws are being adhered to. We need to make sure that we have independence in those really important bodies so that we can trust them. This is all about, as we said, rebuilding trust in our democracy, rebuilding trust in those democratic institutions. And then that way, if people trust their democracy, trust their politicians, trust their political system, then we can move forward. At the moment, there is growing distrust, and I think that's what happens when you start undermining the science. We need to allow science to be key to the decisions that we're making.
Yeah, I agree with Soph, and I agree with you, Bernie, in that I think we're at real danger of a Trumpian post-truth polity. Essentially. Good example, last year Tanya Plibersek put a piece of legislation in front of the House which got passed and really didn't register with the media, and I've asked lots of people if they ever heard about it. Most people haven't. And it was called the Sea Dumping Bill. They didn't even try to give it a fancy name. It was basically about carbon capture and storage off the coast of Timor-Leste, in the seabed off the coast of Timor-Leste, and the government facilitating that. At the time, crossbench jumped up and down. We were outraged by it and disgusted by the fact that the government was pushing this bill through in the way that it did. It did not register in the media. Most people do not know about it. And what we said at the time is the government was doing this to further the commercial interests of Santos. They denied it. We've now got FOI, which clearly demonstrates that decision was orchestrated to help Santos and Impex. It's as clear could be, but it hasn't made it to the media and most Australian people aren't aware of it. This week, the government was going to put up another piece of legislation which the Minister for Resources, Madeleine King, was trying to get past Tanya Plibersek. I mean, the bar that Tanya Plibersek has put, I have to say, it's really disappointingly low, but Minister King is doing this extraordinary manoeuvre where she's trying to bypass even that to give herself power to approve offshore gas projects and offshore gas exploration and bypassing the ministerial yay or nay of the Environment Minister. That bill was supposed to be debated today. It's been taken off the bill. We're not quite clear if that's because we were so outraged by it or perhaps there was outrage from within the government itself. But again, that hasn't hit the media. Most people are not aware of it. What we have seen, and it's been incredibly disappointing, is decision-making which is at the behest of the large fossil fuel multinationals. That's what we're seeing. We saw it with the last government, but we're seeing it with this government as well. And that the lack of transparency around that is incredibly disappointing. And I think it's fair to say that the independents are scrambling, to find the evidence of this and to try and hold the government to account on it. But we've got, limited time, limited resources, and we're getting a lot of help from expert bodies and expert groups. But the lack of transparency around decision making is still there. It's still a problem, and it's still affecting decisions that the government is making every week.
Dr. Green.
Yeah, so in terms of the fossil fuel industry's influence over Australian politics, so Sophie and Monique are doing fantastic work, and other independents looking at the way the industry influences government, jobs for mates, lobbying, donations, revolving door, and that's absolutely critical. One thing I just wanted to also mention is it's really important to also think about and how we can address the way that the industry influences the public. And a couple of ideas to think about here. There may well be people working on this already, but so one is through what they're allowed to say in public, and there's a lot of misleading information or misinformation around this. And so I know the Australia Institute's doing work on sort of truth in political advertising and so on. So there's an important aspect there about sort of regulating misinformation, and that's particularly important for climate and fossil fuels. The other thing is also around sponsorship. So the fossil fuel industry has its tentacles in communities. It sponsors sporting institutions. It sponsors cultural institutions. I'm not sure if do they still sponsor the police in Queensland, Richard?
It's a ad hoc arrangement.
Okay, yeah. So we need to legislate to stop that. And just a quick example, we've done this before. So in Victoria, possibly in other states as well, I'm Victorian, so I'm perhaps being parochial, but when the government banned tobacco advertising and sponsorship, so, well, first of all, it did that, and second of all, to sort of minimise the backlash from the legitimate sports clubs and so on that benefited from this sponsorship, it actually basically bought them out. It basically paid, it sort of replaced the tobacco industry's sponsorship. So we've done this before, so there are ways to kind of diminish the industry's sort of public standing as well.
And Mr. Fraser, did you want to add anything to why we still don't have integrity in climate policy in Australia?
Yes, please. I think there are a lot of overarching changes that need to be made to get Australia back on the road to a decent democracy rather than one heading in the Trump direction. And there are all sorts of things that have to be done. My favourite trifecta of changes is a effective national anti-corruption commission. We've got that one. The first leg's up, right?
Thanks to a couple of
The second one is public funding of federal elections to take out all the pressure of the lobbyists. And just to cut back some donations from big donors to particular parties, that's not going to have any effect at all. There's all sorts of ways around that. And the third leg, so we're still waiting for the second leg and for the third leg, which is a revamp of the public service so that you get competent public servants in there that are not politicised. They're there to serve the public, and they'll provide good advice for that, and they'll push out the ministerial officers and the lobbyists that are causing a lot of the problems at the moment. So they're the things that would make for a better democracy, and that in time would make for the easier passage and implementation of some of these climate change things we're talking about. But they're not going to happen quickly. Those and other changes that are necessary. And in the meanwhile, it's going to be people power that is going to bring pressure to bear on governments to do the sorts of things we've been talking about, that are measures that will work and generate big improvements. And I think we've demonstrated in a way, and Richard's outfit was very significant in bringing about the changes to the stage 3 tax changes. So that was, persistence can work and help, and it can work. It'll work in climate change as well on the sorts of things we've been talking about. In fact, it might be a bit easier now because the climate push is much more sophisticated now. It's much more stronger. We've got a lot of independently thinking people in the Parliament now who think about climate change and are concerned about it than we've ever had before. So we've got scientists, we've got people in the Parliament that are on side on this these days, and a lot more of them. We've got leaders in the public sector, in the private sector, industry that want to do more, and we've got school children, young people that are very supportive too. So there's a better chance of getting some progress on these fronts and keeping the pressure up on them. I think that all these sort of people, scientists and independents in the Parliament and so on, if they can exercise what we've been, or I've been talking about in terms of making for a better democracy. You know, they focus in the debates on things like honesty, not lies, restraint, not greed, on compassion and understanding, not hate and fear, which is characterised. You know, you have to look back to the early debates back on climate change years ago, or more recently, look at the debates in Parliament and elsewhere on the vote, on the voice vote. You know, it was, and there's so many things, but they're not. They can only be served and treated by having overarching changes, which are going to take time. But in the meanwhile, on the climate change things, your group and all these other people and you've got a lot more supporters and more vocal supporters, more influential supporters these days to get some of these things done on climate change. So that's the only ray of hope that I can sort of point to at the moment.
I just wanted to briefly flag that a couple of our Pacific speakers today are actually off at a press conference right now on the bill that Monique was referring to earlier. So doing double duty while they're here. I wanted to go back to a point you made, Monique, about the fact that you come from a health-based background, and as does Sophie. What would an evidence-based response from the government to climate change look like? And then to expand that out to everyone else, how do we get there?
Well, all the evidence is there of what we need for action on climate change locally. And there's a huge amount of evidence, increasing evidence about the health impact of the anthropogenic climate change that we've seen already. I mean, it's all there. We keep reinventing the wheel, and there keep being new reports about this and about that. And of course they're helpful, but it's all there already. What we need the government to do is walk the walk, really. It's kind of told us what it needs to do. It's told us it believes in the science. It's looked at the science before, but it's not acting to this point in a way that's consistent with that. And the simple, most important thing that this government could do right now is to give industry the certainty that it needs and the investment support that it needs and the vision that it needs for sectoral remediation of energy, transport, and all the other sectors that need to be addressed as a matter of urgency, with a plan for how we're going to actually achieve what we say we're going to achieve, whether that be by 2030 or by 2050. So the industry is telling us that they need that certainty. They need to understand where the money's going to go and how. And that has been lacking to date. And the climate policy that we've seen the rollout of it has been too slow. We're all now struggling with great uncertainty and anxiety about the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, the EPPC Act, which we had hoped to see 12 months ago, and which we may not see before the next election, which would be a tragedy potentially. But it's a bit too slow and too bitsy at this point in time, and we need the government to show real commitment to what it has said that it believes and will do in the past.
Did you want to add anything to that, Dr. Scamps?
Thank you. Yes. So both Monique and I, all of medicine is based on evidence-based medicine, evidence-based decision-making. That's where we come from, and that's what we expect. But when it comes to climate change, that is not what's happening. So we just had a briefing with the Climate Council yesterday. The evidence is we need to be net zero by 2035 if we are to have a livable future to keep to 1.5 degrees. They also have a pathway. The technology is there. The pathway there is, they're setting out the pathway. So what do we need? We need to take the politics out of it. And we keep talking about this. And again, it's about building back integrity into our democratic system. I wanted to sort of talk about the sea dumping bill as well, because at the moment what we have is a government that's trying to act, that know that they need to act, but are also heavily influenced by trying to keep industry happy at the same time. So you have a government that's speaking out of both sides of its mouth currently. So what we're seeing is that there will be a step forward. We had the safeguard mechanism, great. Every new gas project had to be net zero from day one, any new or expanded. But then we saw this back door come around where the sea dumping bill had to be, a way around that was provided because of the influence of companies like Santos. So again, it comes down to how do we build the strength of our democracy, and it comes down to ending jobs for mates. It comes down to greater transparency of donations, restricting donations from certain harmful industries, and it comes down to lobbying reform as well. So we just need to take the politics out of this. The evidence is there, the technology is there, and the pathway is there, and what is stopping is the politics.
I'll just open that up to our other panellists if you have any ideas on how we can get back to evidence-based policy in Australia on this. Yeah?
Well, I don't know I'm not a medical person, so I'm not sure about the same relevance of evidence detail. You can see the evidence everywhere you look. You can see what's happening to the community, and every day you can tell by the temperature or by the rain or the heat and so on. You don't need any evidence that we're in trouble, that the planet is a fragile planet getting into more trouble. I think the evidence is self-evident, and really it's more a matter of getting action on things that work, and that comes back to the political interference or involvement when those sort of things should be squeezed out in different ways, like better advice from a better public service and excluding the power of the lobbyists on their influence on at election times. I've never heard of an election where all the politicians that are standing haven't said, we're going to vote for, whether we win or lose the election, if we win, we'll vote for everybody, regardless of how they vote. And next day, by the time the lobbyists have got out for the winners, they've got in, all those commitments, of course, are forgotten, and they're back on what the lobbyists want, what their ideologies tell them they want, and that's it, and the rest are forgotten. And those things have to be tackled, and they're big order things rather than evidence things.
Yeah, so I would just add that, we have a huge amount of evidence, and obviously listening to the evidence is critical, but we can't forget that these are values-based decisions, right? How much we want, how much we should try and target to sort of, minimise climate change, right? Like there's values involved in that. There are values involved in the different types of policies we pursue to reduce emissions and to decarbonise our region. There are values at stake in the supplementary policies we have to support workers to transition, to provide social safety nets, because this is going to be somewhat disruptive, right? So there are going to be, if we have narrow policies, winners and losers. If you have broader policies with some of these other social and labour market and regional policies, then you can spread the gains and losses out, ensure that the losers are the wealthiest and those who can bear it most, and that ordinary people are the winners. But we can't escape from the fact that there are values-based decisions to make as well. And because there's values, it has to be somewhat political. I know what you mean when you say we have to take the politics out of it. It's sort of more that kind of opportunistic partisan politics. But these are political choices, and so we can't deny that there's politics, but we need to be smart about our politics. And so, and the evidence that's relevant there is social science, political science, right? We kind of know, we have a good sense of the kinds of ways in which we can build mass coalitions of the public and of social movements, of trade unions and so on, right? We know how to build interest groups around a common vision, and that involves tackling climate change alongside other important issues like the housing crisis and inequality and poverty and so on, right? So it's about, the politics is more, I think, about how we can build the public and interest group supporter base for the kinds of rapid and comprehensive action that we need.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'd like to add to two comments there. One is the people power. That is it is amazing. So the grassroots movement is why Monique and I are here today. I started with just my friend in our community, talking to each other, talking to our friends, and it rolled on, and it was extremely powerful in the end. So people power is amazing. And I would also say that something like the National Anti-Corruption Commission came about because the people at the last election demanded it. People were aware of it and they demanded it and they voted for it. The other thing I think is you're absolutely right. What was at the last election was there was greater choice for people when it came into their elections. So we need to make sure that people don't only have, a binary choice. There needs to be further choice. We need to let our democracy thrive. And I think this whole movement of the community independent, and I don't want to just talk about us, but people who are going to genuinely represent their communities or an alternate way forward or listen to the science, there's got to be that option as well. So I think growing our democracy, making it vibrant, making it open to more people being able to stand and represent their communities is a really important part of getting proper action on climate change so that we can listen to the science and act on the science.
Dr. Green, I wanted to come back to something you said in your remarks, which is that Australia is a powerful country. I mean, climate change is a global issue, and we often get told that our emissions are tiny in the scheme of things, but then of course there are our exports as well. But how do you think Australia can leverage its particular power to influence global action?
Yeah, so I think that the biggest influence we have globally is our fossil fuel exports, right? Our power in markets for fossil fuels. And so this comes back to what I was saying in my opening remarks about the need to ensure that all the things we're doing in terms of domestic emissions reduction are part of a wider foreign policy strategy. And so, and that means, yes, doing things like, stopping new fossil fuel production projects in Australia. Absolutely, we should be doing that. But we also should be thinking about our convening power, our ability, we need to we'll need to talk to and negotiate with our trading partners, with other fossil fuel suppliers, with the suppliers of coal-fired power generation technology like Japan, right? So we need to develop a regional strategy. There are lots of examples from Australia's past of where we've really led the world on a number of issues. Polly mentioned a number of them in her opening remarks, like the Antarctic mining ban treaty. One example that often comes back to is around, it's really a suite of examples around Australia's leadership on nuclear weapons. And we did lots of different things. And I'll just mention one that it won't be sufficient, but it could be a good starting point. So the Keating government, I think it was 1995, established something called the Canberra Commission on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. And it was really an evidence building, right? And we don't need that on climate, but I think it would be useful to convene a range of experts and public figures. So in the nuclear weapons example, they basically made the case on security grounds, geopolitical, economic and environmental grounds for nuclear non-proliferation and elimination. And that led to political momentum, that led to more substantive and legal initiatives. And so we should be doing something like that on fossil fuels and then use the momentum from that to start to build, for instance, work towards, say, a treaty or regional agreement to stop new fossil fuel production and consumption projects, for instance.
Did you want to add something?
I'd like to just add that the way that we do politics at the moment, there's really siloed thinking or siloed decision making. So the resources minister doesn't really talk to the environment minister, that type of thing. We can see that happening right now. In other countries, they have a Wellbeing for Future Generations Act and Commissioner. And within that, you try and get this long-term vision, long-term decision-making, so you're not just driven by this short-term 3-year political cycle where you are just having to try and win votes every time and keep everyone happy. So I've also been looking what's happening with this Wellbeing of Future Generations, because what happens is you try and break down that siloed thinking. And the example that I use is in Wales, which is leading this type of initiative. There was a road and traffic issue. There was far too much congestion. The decision was made that they probably needed a new freeway, but this new framework came in and they had to actually consult with the other ministries as well. So they had to think about the public health implications, the environment implications, what would happen on climate change, So all these other implications had to come into this, be fed into this decision. And the decision completely changed. It came down to, all right, we need to increase our active and public transport. So that's how we should be making our decisions, rather than this siloed thinking, which is really building this tension. As I said, talking out of both sides of your mouth is what's happening at the moment. We need to come together and make this, concerted decision making together.
Mr. Fraser?
I just wanted to add a point about the global nature of climate change and the consequences of that. In Australia, as a nation, we're going to have vulnerable groups, increased inequality, and they'll have to be dealt with. But we have to remember also that globally there is going to be increases in inequality from countries and regions. South Pacific Islanders, for example, are already feeling that. And this is something that I think that needs to be kept in mind and not forgotten, and that is something that should be addressed as it's occurring, not something that's deferred to the never and you come back 20 years later and deal with it. But the omens there are not all that encouraging, really. At the Paris Agreement that was reached in 2015, I think, there was an agreement by 120 countries or whatever that they would set up a fund and they'd contribute to a fund to help countries that were having difficulty raising money to deal with climate change and to reduce their own emissions, and all sorts of commitments were made to contribute to that fund. But unfortunately, and there'll be people in this room that might know firsthand, but those commitments haven't been met. The amounts that were being promised and foreshadowed to go to the developing countries haven't been met the way that they were promised. So I just think that's another dimension of climate change that shouldn't be forgotten by Australians, even though we have our own inequality. There's also the global inequality, the country inequality to remember.
I actually think that that's something which may drive some of our decision making in the near future, if only out of self-interest, because we're going to be seeing influxes of climate refugees, and we're going to see health disasters in low-lying countries like Bangladesh if we don't take action soon, and we will end up having to deal with that in a much more immediate way. We're also seeing the spread of many infectious diseases southward as the climate changes, and we're seeing the pattern of some of those infectious diseases change, and we're going to have to deal with that as well. So even, it's like politics, you can choose not to be interested in it, but you can't choose not to be affected by it. I think that we're going to see the practical implications of climate change hitting us more and more clearly, more starkly in the near future.
I wanted to return to a point that Mr. Fraser made in his remarks about the idea of a carbon price. And of course you were the inaugural chair of the Climate Change Authority under the Gillard government, and so you saw the original scheme we had up close. Do you think we're hearing more and more mention of carbon price again from many leaders such as yourself? Do you think there's a growing appetite to return to the idea?
No, but with a strong, not from political sources, unless we're talking about a stronger pro-climate group, and we've got that now from all sorts of groups that I mentioned, including our independents in the Parliament that can help do that. But no, in my time, the government, the coalition government in time, wasn't the slightest bit interested. Of course, their only policy objective was to abolish the Climate Change Authority as quickly as possible. But there is a chance, I think, of reviving it because it will work. It raises revenue, but it just needs to get over this concern. It's a tax, or whether you call it a tax or a price, it doesn't matter. It'll end up being viewed as a tax. But not all taxes are bad, as my friend here will tell you in considerable detail. But it needs to be pursued. But I think we're in a position where we have such a cohort of organised and influential people in the pro-climate area now that there is a case for taking on the government on something like this.
I might ask
trying to persuade them.
our crossbenchers if there's any interest in pushing on a carbon price.
It's interesting, isn't it? The carbon levy was successful, and now we've got two of the country's lead economists, Rod Sims and Ross Garnaut, who are advocating it, but it's just not on the table, and it doesn't look like it will be on the table. It was just a yep, no way. And so it's something that should be considered that isn't being considered. So again, are we doing what is the best thing to act on climate? As we said, there are so many different reasons why we need to act on climate change, for health reasons, for security reasons, for every reason under the sun. But we're not even looking at the levers that would be most effective for political reasons. The Labor Party has been burnt on that a long time. They're not going to go there, and the coalition has never gone there. So again, it comes down to people power.
Yeah, that's right. The political parties have frightened themselves, each other away from anything like that, but they have to be brought back, or not the Liberals, coalition, you can forget about them coming back, but the others might be prepared to listen and to consider it as part of a deal.
Well, and that is part of the role of the crossbench, actually, is to be, to put things on the table and to give the major parties, or particularly the government, social licence to address them and talk about them. As you say, Bernie, if we don't, we'll end up paying carbon border adjustment mechanism fines, and we'll lose control of the conversation. So we can choose to be proactive and do things well and in a way that under which we have control, or we can pay the same thing anyway in a reactive fashion over which we have less control. It's up to the government to show leadership on that.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing, which is that if and when we do have a further debate about a carbon price, I would really urge that we focus that debate on a carbon tax rather than an emissions trading scheme. And I'll just briefly explain why, because I think it's an important point. Now, economists will say if you have an optimal policy, it doesn't matter if it's a tax or an emissions trading scheme. But to have an optimal policy, you need optimal politics. And I think everyone in this room would agree that our politics is not now and never will be anything close to optimal. So what that means is whatever scheme we have, if it's a carbon tax or if it's a carbon emissions trading scheme, it's going to be inadequate in and of itself. It means we're going to need multiple policy instruments, and if you have multiple policy instruments targeting the same sectors, then you want a carbon tax, because the carbon tax will add to all of the emissions reduction work that the other schemes, your renewable energy targets, your vehicle standards and everything, it will add to that, whereas an emissions trading scheme, for complex reasons I won't go into, basically they end up sort of cancelling each other out because you have a fixed cap, and so the other policies just end up reducing the price of permits. So in a slogan, a carbon tax plays nice with other policies, an emissions trading scheme doesn't. And so I would really urge that if and when we have this debate, we really push for a carbon tax.
I wanted to also ask Dr. Ryan, but also anyone who might have some thoughts on the influence of lobbying in politics, and ask you currently have a Clean Up Politics Act that you're pushing a campaign on. How do you think anti-lobbying legislation, specifically yours, could help clean up our climate integrity?
I'm very happy to speak to that. So the private members bill that I've put up at the end of last year is about lobbying, and essentially it's pretty clean. It just basically says that everyone who's in this building to lobby on behalf of a significant third party has to put that on the register. and the register will be publicly searchable. And so we know that there's 15 lobbyists in this building every day for every member of parliament. We just don't know, yes, 15. We don't know who they are or who they're meeting with. So the lobbyists will all go onto a register. At the moment, only 20% of them do, and the register's not enforced anyway, so it's like smacking people around the head with a piece of wet tissue paper. So we'll have this lobbying register, and the lobbyists have to say who they've met with and when. So it'll be, okay, so I met with Minister Rowlands about sports betting at Society Restaurant for over 3 hours on her birthday. That sort of meeting register thing. I know that sounds snarky, but it's true. And it happens, so that's okay. So basically we'll know who's meeting with who and when. The ministers also have to open up their diaries. So we know that Catherine King has or has not met with Qantas about whether or not Qatar should be given extra routes. We know the basis for decision making that we otherwise spend hours and hours and hours in question time tediously trying to get to the bottom of and don't manage to do that. So we'll know who the ministers are talking to and why. We'll also close the revolving door so that senior public servants and ministers can't be employed in an industry over which they've held sway for 3 years after leaving office. Thank you. I think that the current record at this moment is 5 days for Christopher Pyne to work into the defence industry, walk into a defence industry job after he left the Ministry for Defence. But senior public servants are doing it as well. We don't have any insight into that because we actually don't know where the public servants are working and what they're doing as well. And it really does call into question that whole thing about truth and trust. How do we trust Scott Morrison that the AUKUS decision was a great idea when he's now working with Mike Pompeo on defence procurements for the US? I don't trust him. And I don't think you trust him. And why should the public trust us if we're behaving in that fashion? So that's what the Clean Up Politics Act will be. You can't restore trust in the process if you can't be seen to be making an effort to be transparent and acting with integrity. The public hasn't seen that from Australian politicians for a long time, and that's through the suite of measures that we've talked about and others, like truth and political advertising, that's what we're trying to achieve.
I thought I might finish on a quick fire round. What I want to know from each of you is what is the number one thing the Albanese government could do in the next year to regain its climate integrity?
I think we need to be able to trust the independence of the bodies that are underpinning our democracy. So we need to be able to trust the Environment Protection Agency, for example, is independent and acting without influence from lobbyists and industry. I think that is a really powerful way forward. And that means introducing something like my Ending Jobs for Mates bill so that the people who are appointed to these boards or these bodies are independently appointed because of their expertise and because of their independence. I think that would be extremely powerful.
As I've said, I think one key thing would be banning new fossil fuel projects and project extensions and leveraging that commitment to convene regional trading partners, other fossil fuel suppliers and consumers to replicate that on a regional level. And I'll just make one final point, which I think links a number of the themes we were just discussing around democracy, is that to tackle climate change, we know we will need a bigger state. We will need the state to do more, to regulate, to tax, and to spend, to invest, right? And so if we need a bigger state, then these issues of integrity and the quality of our democracy and the quality of decision-making are only going to become more and more important. So they are intimately interconnected.
So the integrity measures are important, but the one thing that we need from the government is a climate trigger. So basically, whether we put it into all politicians love applause. We've been trying to get the government to put it into the EPPC Act. They're saying they're not going to do it. But what we need is a piece of legislation that says that every piece of legislation that the government passes has to take into account the implications of that piece of legislation on the climate, and that demonstrably it will not worsen climate change, that it will, that will take into account emissions and the effect of those. And if we had that one overarching piece of legislation, we won't have any new coal or gas. We will have what we need, which is we will restore trust in our government that is making our decisions in our best interest.
Well, I'd like to see the Prime Minister and his relevant ministers to stop pussyfooting around on climate change, and biodiversity issues, and start building up some credentials for being a serious policymaker when it comes to dealing with the climate crisis, biodiversity crises we have here, and start building up some credentials by announcing before the next election that they're going to not phase down but phase out new fossil fuel projects, and stop new ones but phase out the old ones pretty promptly. That would establish a few credentials perhaps for them.
And I think Dr.
I
Scott's
wanted
one
to
final
add
point as well.
Just one final thing is there are steps. The government is making good steps. What we need to see happen, that every time there's a good step, there's not a back door around it. So what Monique was talking about with the climate trigger is fantastic. But at the end of last year, we got the water trigger in. I'd been fighting hard for that, as had the Greens. But now there's a back door around it because the industry, the corporations don't have to refer it if they don't feel it's needed to. It doesn't happen mandatorily. So we've got to stop creating back doors around what are good policy decisions.
Well, there you have it. I think that's a pretty good list for the government there. End jobs for mates, no more coal and gas, climate trigger, and stop pussyfooting around. Thank you so much to our four panellists today, Dr. Sophie Scamps, Dr. Fergus Ryan, Dr. Monique Ryan, and Mr. Bernie Fraser. And thank you all so much for coming. I think it's now lunchtime, but I'll hand over to Liz to...
Thanks for watching. We love that we can make these videos free to watch, but they're not free to make. It's thanks to our generous supporters that we can keep making research and content that changes minds. So, if you like what we do, please consider giving to the Australia Institute so we can keep doing it. Visit our website australiainstitute.org.au and click the donate button to see how your support can help fund high quality research that matters.